Hi, everybody. I'm Tracy Butcher, the Director of Outreach here in Cocoa, Florida for Wildlands Network. I've been with the organization for over 12 years as a lead in fundraising efforts and outreach. Before my career with Wildlands Network, I was the Development Director of the Brevard Zoo here in Florida, and before that, I spent 15 years in Africa as a biologist and then a community-based safari operator. This is one of the best turnouts we've had for our webinar series. So we're very, very pleased to have you all here with us today. And I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules as we talk about building wildlife corridors state by state. I'm going to first introduce our panelists for today, and then we will hand everything over. Greg Costello is our executive director, and he provides the strategic direction for Wildlands Network's programs and management. He's also lends his expertise as an environmental attorney to our Connectivity Policy Coalition, which was initiated by Wildlands Network in 2008. Greg has spent 16 years, in environmental law before beginning his decade-long stint as executive director of the Western Environmental Law Center in Eugene, Oregon. Seeking a broader geographical focus and more inclusive approach to conservation, Greg joined Wildlands Network in 2013 and lives on Bainbridge Island with his wife Cindy and his 2 Cocker Spaniels. Next in line will be Phil Carter. Phil Carter is our wildlife policy coordinator for the Southwest region of the United States, and he coordinates policy reform and public engagement for wildlife conservation and habitat connectivity within New Mexico and the Southwestern region. Through partnerships with state, federal, and tribal policymakers and stakeholder groups, he works to advance wildlife habitat conservation initiatives at the state level. Phil's engaged in twin interests of environmentalism, politics, and advocating for wilderness and Mexican wolves. In his free time, Phil engages in hands-on habitat restoration work with groups including the Albuquerque Wildlife Federation. And Phil lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico with his wife, Christina. After Phil, we will introduce you to Susan Holmes, who is our policy director and has long been passionate about protecting wildlands and wildlife. Susan combines a love of advocacy with expertise in media, government, and the workings of Capitol Hill. For Wildlands Network, she leads a coalition of national organizations who is stewarding national corridor legislation, and she has been a driving force in the National Wildlife Conservation Corridors Act, which is being reintroduced tomorrow to the House with bipartisan support. The bill addresses protections for native species and their habitat, incorporates wildlife connectivity into federal climate strategies, and mitigates wildlife vehicle collisions. She's also been involved with state corridor legislation in New Hampshire, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Susan lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband, who is also a fellow environmentalist, and her resume includes a decade-long stint as senior legislative representative for Earth Justice and Save Our Wild Salmon Coalition. After the presentation, we will have an opportunity for people to ask questions. So you can type them into the questions call box on your screen, and we will answer them in the order that we receive them throughout the presentation. If there's time at the end, we might be able to open it up a little bit for discussion. But without further ado, I think that's great for introductions. Again, thank you very, very much for joining us today. We appreciate it. And I will hand over now to Greg Costello, our Executive Director.
Thanks, Tracy, and good morning, everyone. At least we have over 70 people on our webinar today, so that is great news. I'm going to cover an overview of our strategies and how the state corridor legislation work fits into those strategies. And then I'll also mention a little bit of our work in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon and Washington, and then I'll turn it over to Phil and Susan to talk about New Mexico, other states, and the federal bill. So to start, our mission is to reconnect, restore, and rewild North America. Our goal is to nothing less than to save 90% of the existing biodiversity on the continent, which, if you're familiar with, for instance, the most recent IUCN report from a couple of days ago of over 1 million species at risk, that is no small task that we're engaged in. Since 1991, we've focused that strategy in part on wildlife connectivity and wildlife corridors connecting core habitats. So where we start, our strategy has 3 basic prongs. One, science. We need to know where these corridors are. Where are animals moving? Where are they today? Where are they going to move in 5 years or 10 years or 50 years? And with climate change, that makes that analysis a bit tricky. But once we know where we want to protect, then we have to figure out the how. If it's private lands, do you buy it? If it's state or federal lands, how do we appropriately manage it? And that's the bucket where the state legislative and national legislative strategies come into play. And then the third bucket is, all right, once you know where you need to work, and once you have the tools to protect or restore something, then you've got to get down to the ground level and actually, work with communities, work with stakeholders, and ensure that those paper protections are actually enacted on the ground. So those are our 3 strategies that we use to approach all of this. And before we get into the state legislative strategy, I want to spend just a couple minutes on the science to share with you how we try to figure out where these corridors are that we want to protect. So I'm just going to very quickly run through our analysis for the Eastern Wildway to give you an idea of what we're talking about when we say we're science-based.
Craig, can I just interrupt you for a second? Oh, there you are. Okay, never mind. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to go ahead and share my screen, Tracy?
That's what I was going to say. You actually do have to share your own screen, but I am seeing it, so I think you're good.
Okay. All right. So hopefully what everyone is seeing now is a shot of our map of the Eastern Wildway that we've done. Dark green, our core areas, lighter green, our connective corridors between those core areas. And this map isn't something that we just sort of drew out of our mind's eye, and it has a lot of history. Back in the 90s, one of our founders, Reed Noss, was very instrumental in mapping Florida, for instance, using a lot of basic naturalist approaches. But we've become more sophisticated over the years with GIS tools and other mapping tools, and we've gradually refined our effort and started incorporating more and more types of mapping. So for instance, Mark Anderson at the Nature Conservancy has now done resiliency analysis across the United States. We've worked closely with Mark in incorporating his data. We've worked with the Southeast Climate Action Center and their data. We've worked with the large landscape collaboratives. We've worked with other scientists looking at identifying corridors between wilderness areas, other climate connectivity analyses, and then our own work, which has looked both at climate adaptation throughout the South. One of our colleagues, or in the large collective sense, Nikada, looking at connectivity across the Southeast. We've gradually refined all of this. We've looked at satellite imagery to help refine it. We've talked to partners to help ground truth it and establish where cores are, where corridors. And we've gradually refined this into a tool and a map that looks like this in the broad scale, but which you can also scroll into and use at a much finer scale. So for instance, land trusts can work with our maps and go down, I think, to about at least the county level, if not smaller, in terms of analyzing habitat to protect as corridors. We're working with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, which wants to expand the trail in order to widen it for wildlife. So they're looking at new acquisition strategies. Our biological and habitat analysis is assisting them in targeting areas along the trail. And of course, with road ecology, we can see where major roads are crossing important wildlife habitat and help guide work with DOT. So that's the type of work we're talking about when we say science-based. This is an early map of the Pacific Northwest and the Wildway. This is an amalgam of existing climate adaptation modeling. It's very much a work in progress with more layers such as land ownership, species, movement patterns to be included. But in essence, we use cutting edge science to figure out where we need to work. So that is our basic science approach. Now, once we know where, then we have to figure out, what are the tools? And for me as a lawyer, that I have a predilection towards, legislative type tools, laws, regulations. So on federal lands, we have existing regulations in the National Forest Management Act requiring the Forest Service to plan for connectivity, both within a national forest and on its boundaries. If you're looking at private lands, of course, you have land trusts that can acquire easements, acquire land to protect wildlife. But there's a lot of land then that's left out, state lands, private lands. And so, we've worked to figure out, how do we improve protections for those lands, those habitats, as well as the whole federal corpus. It's not, the national forests don't cover the whole landscape of federal holdings, and they're not really all that enforceable. So we started working way back with colleagues, Rob Ament, Gary Tabor at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, other members of our Connectivity Policy Coalition. Discussions started back when Representative Rush Holt was in Congress about the possibility of a federal bill. And, folks worked to craft a bill. It never really went anywhere. Discussions died off until around 2016, when newly elected Congressman Beyer in the District of Northern Virginia became interested in pursuing a federal bill, and Susan will fill you in on those details. About that same time, though, we started working with Ruth Musgrave at the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, who asked us to present at a national forum. Gary Tabor had presented there earlier, but essentially inform interested state legislators about wildlife connectivity and why it was important, how it protected biodiversity, and why we need to protect wildlife corridors. In 2016, November, after the election, I became quite pessimistic about our possibilities of actually seeing the Beyer bill come to fruition in the next 4 years. And so we started looking more closely at other strategies. And states were an obvious one because states had shown leadership on this issue before. In 2008, the Western Governors Association had a wildlife corridor initiative, which really started the ball rolling with Western states and looking at habitat connectivity at a statewide level. Some years later, the New England Governors Association also started looking at wildlife corridors. So between that and a growing interest identified by Ruth and her caucus of environmental legislators, we decided to start a state wildlife corridor bill campaign. We started by thinking about where are the willing states, where are the legislators that are expressing interest to Ruth in passing a bill, and let's just start there. It didn't take us too long, though, to realize that a number of our important colleagues were having similar ideas. So Center for Large Landscape Conservation, Endangered Species Coalition, and of course Ruth at the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. We all came together to form a small, fairly informal working group to push this idea forward. And in a very short time, these discussions started really in late 2017, and we really started putting in the effort in early 2018. And it's been a fairly remarkable year in terms of progress. As Phil will tell you, there's been a bill passed in New Mexico. Yesterday was a Senate hearing on a bill in Oregon that's already passed out of the House. A bill was introduced in Virginia and stalled out in committee. Other states are looking at bills, states like Pennsylvania. New Hampshire has now passed two corridor bills. First, a study bill, or at least, they've passed one, a study bill a few years ago, and looking at another bill. So interest has exploded really across the country in getting states involved in corridor legislation and protecting wildlife corridors. Here at Wildlands Network, our contribution to that effort has been, in addition to science, very much focused on the law and policy. We had two law students as interns last summer who drafted model state legislation. They also drafted state-specific bills for New Mexico, Oregon, Washington, and Virginia, and those drafts formed the basis of the initial drafting of bills by those state legislators. So we are continuing down that path. We hope to have capacity this year to actually drill down even further and start looking at county and city ordinances, open space regulations, because as wildlife don't recognize any type of land ownership boundaries, we need to ensure that there are protections in place really at every nested level of government across the landscape. So that's the basic strategy that we've moved forward in the past couple of years, and we will continue to push forward with that. I'm going to turn it over to Phil. Well, excuse me, no, I'm not going to turn over to Phil just yet. Let me just share with you what we are doing in Oregon. Let me get to the right screen. So here's the Oregon bill. I apologize, obviously it's too small to read, but a quick summary. The Oregon bill has been modified from our original draft, but it essentially would require the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to analyze and using best available science and data to come up with a plan for wildlife connectivity across the state. And it would provide guidance to other agencies. It would look at species of concern and that are at risk. It would look at fragmentation. It would examine known migration patterns and corridors, look at climate change, how that's going to impact species movement, identify human barriers like roads, and look at other ways to catalog existing wildlife corridors, find areas of high priority for connectivity and protection, and work with the Department of Transportation to look at reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. And we're happy to say that even without this bill, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is well on their way through its own habitat connectivity program at doing a lot of what's really called out for in this plan. So we hope that this bill will pass and give some extra tools to the department and other agencies in Oregon to move this forward. So that's a bill that we've offered testimony on, along with many of our partners, and the state representatives and state senators feel that it has a very good chance of getting out of the Senate, and then it would go to Governor Brown's desk and hopefully for signature relatively soon. So that was this has potential to be a great success in Oregon. In Washington, we have state senators who are very interested in running a corridors bill, but this year the docket was overwhelmed by protections for orca and clean energy matters, and getting a corridors bill just didn't rise to a high enough level on the priority list for 2019, but we have plans to come back in 2020 and take another run at that. And these state senators are interested not only in our wild places, but they're also interested in perhaps looking at our land use laws, our Growth Management Act, to see how we provide for wildlife movement through more urban and suburban and working landscapes. So there's hope on the horizon in Washington. There's hope in California. There are some existing statutes on the books in California, and we have state legislators who are interested in expanding those to a broader, more inclusive strategy. So that's what's going on in the Pacific Northwest. And now I will turn it over to Phil to talk about New Mexico, and hopefully at the end there'll be time for any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Greg. I'm going to go ahead and change it over now for Phil. Just give me a second. All righty then.
Hey, everyone. And thank you, Greg, and thank you, Tracy, and also thanks to everybody who's joining us today. My name's Phil Carter. I am the Wildlife Policy Coordinator for New Mexico and the Southwest, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about the New Mexico Wildlife Corridors Act. Let me get it up on my screen here. Wildlife Corridors Act was run in this year's state legislative session. You see a copy of the official chartered edition of the past legislation with the title New Mexico Wildlife Corridors Act and Senate Bill 228 listed there at the bottom. We're very proud of this legislation and how we all came together to really pass a strong forward-thinking piece of policy to affect habitat connectivity and wildlife migration in New Mexico, which is the 5th largest state in the union. And so hopefully this webinar will be kind of an opportunity to kind of share the New Mexico experience with the Wildlife Corridors Act passage, and possibly even serve as a model to other states in the country who might be interested in doing this. And so the bill was signed into law by Governor Lujan Grisham on March 28th. And it is really the first kind of legislation, first legislation of its kind, rather, in the United States, for reasons I will get into in the next slide here. And this is what the new law mandates. Senate Bill 228 directs the New Mexico Department of Transportation and New Mexico Department of Game and Fish to collaborate in identifying and protecting wildlife corridors. And so it's a very specific piece of legislation dedicated to the habitats that enables wildlife migration, and also identifies the barriers, including roadways, fencing, walls, other issues impacting wildlife migration. So it outlines specific proposals, including the creation of a state wildlife corridors action plan that includes identification of existing highways and other human-caused barriers impacting animal migration. It also directs the agencies involved to gather information about habitats and movement needs of species of concern. And so it basically mandates the experts at these two agencies, New Mexico Department of Transportation, New Mexico Game and Fish Department are very well-funded agencies. They have a high level of staff that really study these issues day in and day out, and there's a lot of existing data, but a lot of opportunities to really improve information regarding animal migration and corridors. And also the Corridors Action Plan includes maps to identify existing species of concern, existing wildlife crossings, and areas requiring further research and monitoring. So it exists what is already out there as far as species of concern and wildlife crossings, but also kind of breaks down the door to identify areas that, where further research and monitoring is necessary. And lastly, there's publication of a state wildlife corridors project list that the agencies will be reporting to the state and governor's office as part of the law mandate. And so you can view the full legislation of this bill, Senate Bill 228, at the New Mexico Secretary of State's website. There's the website listed below. We'll also have my email address at the end of the presentation. You can contact me if you'd like to receive a copy of the new law. And so we kind of, since 2018, had a legislative pregame going in order to implement this legislation at in the state roundhouse. And that included compilation of existing information on state and federal corridors initiatives, including the Western Governors Association initiative for wildlife corridors that was passed by all Western Governors Association states in 2007. And as Greg mentioned in his presentation, we had a couple of legal interns who worked hard on getting the model legislation drafted for us. So that was invaluable to our efforts here in New Mexico. We also put together a coalition of coordinated partner groups and citizen activists for advocacy. I need to shout out to Defenders of Wildlife as part of this initiative. Before I came on with Wildlands Network, they were really a large mover and shaker in getting this bill drafted and getting all the coalition partner groups and other agency partners together. And the enlistment of the bill's sponsor, Senator Mimi Stewart. You'll see a photo of her there. Senator Stewart has had a long history of involvement in this issue. She ran some memorials as a member of the New Mexico House and also as the member of the Senate to study impacts of wildlife migration, particularly in the Tijeras Canyon east of Albuquerque, where Interstate 40 goes. And it also kind of cuts off the Sandia and Manzano ranges, the mountain ranges there. And so this is a very important area for wildlife migration, and it was also a very forward-thinking initiative, the Safe Passage Coalition project for that. And so Mimi Stewart was a valued partner in that, in running those memorials. We worked closely with agency staff from the very beginning on with preliminary and follow-up meetings. So Department of Transportation and Department of Game and Fish staff, we made sure that they were at the table in all of the creation of the legislation. And making sure that they were, valued partners throughout, because there's a lot of expertise there within those two agencies. Drafting of legislation and coordination with legislative analysts. For reasons I'll get to in the next slide, the coordination with legislative analysts is a very important aspect of the drafting and creation of legislation. And lastly, the pre-filing of the bill in the state legislature before it began. So just a little bit of background on the state legislature. For the 2019 session, the New Mexico State Legislature convened from mid-January to mid-March. And New Mexico is the only unpaid citizen legislature in the United States, meaning all of the members there are not professional legislators. They either have day jobs or are retired. And so it means that they're very, I'm sorry, was somebody talking?
Sorry.
Okay, no problem. An unpaid citizen legislature means that the legislators, particularly bill sponsors, are very dependent on legislative analysts to do the research and drafting of the bills, and also the advocate organizations, including Wildlands Network, to really help direct the passage of the bill and to make sure the intent of the bill is preserved. Listed below is the breakdown of the House and Senate by Democrat and Republican parties. In New Mexico, you'll see we have strong Democratic majorities in both chambers of the state legislature, and Also importantly, in 2018, Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, who is a Democrat, was elected. And so she marked first time in 8 years that we have had a Democrat governor in New Mexico. And coming off of 8 years of a Republican administration that frequently vetoed legislation passed by the Democratic majority. This meant that the 2019 legislative session was a very frenzied session of everybody trying to get legislation through that had previously been vetoed or wasn't even run because of the threat of veto. And so it made for a very intense session, but also a very exciting one to get legislation passed such as ours. You'll see a photo of the state roundhouse. We have a beautiful capitol here in New Mexico. Process of passing legislation, and you'll see on the right there, those are our two House sponsors who worked with Senator Stewart in the passage of Senate Bill 228 when it went over to the House chamber. Our legislative team included a coalition of supporters, including environmental groups, sportsmen and outfitters, tribal nations, and auto insurance companies also were enlisted because of the issue of vehicle collisions because of road barriers in there. And so all of these groups were valued partners. We were pleased to have some non-traditional partners like business and like sportsmen and outfitters on this legislation. And we also relied closely on on-call testimony from the environmental organizational experts, and the agency experts were also key. As I mentioned, we engaged Department of Transportation and Department of Game and Fish in the process of passing the legislation very early on, and continue to have them, and having agency experts, agency staff person experts from these organizations was key, including even the appointed secretary of the Department of Transportation came out to testify for our bill. So this really made for a strong showing of support and helped us line up some bipartisan support on that. The bill was assigned to 4 committees overall between the 2 chambers. That's pretty typical for a bill of this sort, and it passed relatively smoothly. I will get to the concerns that were raised on the legislation on the next slide. Ultimately, the bill passed the Senate and then the House with just a few days to go in the legislative session, and was passed by concurrence with the Senate owing to some amendments that were made along the way. The concerns raised during the legislative process, any bill is going to have its, concerned parties and even detractors, and our bill was no different. On the issue of the budget, there was, of course, always a question of where is the money for studying and outlining the State Wildlife Corridors Action Plan. Where's that going to come from? And original intent was to fund the mandate using the Game Protection Fund. However, that was resolved with a strong showing of support from the Department of Transportation, who the Secretary and the Governor's Office decided to outline $500,000 from the DOT budget. And so that was a great relief that we didn't have to work with the legislature, who is tasked with, allocating funds to unfunded projects and legislation. And so the fact that we already had that was a huge step in getting this bill passed. There was also concern over the issue of tribal consultation. The bill, as originally drafted, mandated consultation with tribal parties, including the tribal nations of New Mexico. This particular provision within the bill had its opponents based on the notion that you can't really legislate consultation with tribal parties. There's no legal definition of that in their opinion. And so there was a bit of back and forth, but ultimately we were able to put the mandate for tribal consultation in there. Also an issue of private landowner rights. People concerned that the identification of wildlife corridors could mean government oversight of private lands. These concerns were mostly unfounded because, you know, this is not designed to create wildlife corridors. It's to identify existing animal migration and work on best solutions to enhance animal migration through corridors. And so that, however, was a concern raised frequently during the process. There was also a concern of Department of Transportation responsiveness to rural areas as far as road conditions and all of that. Why is money in some people's minds being used to promote wildlife conservation when it could be used to be fixing roads? Again, this was kind of missing the point of the legislation, but it was an issue that needed addressing as part of the process. And lastly, livestock grower concerns and general antipathy to wildlife conservation. You'll find it anywhere. The livestock growers' concerns were as far as the ability for grazing of cattle and sheep to be able to use crossings, as well as not impede their ability to graze. This was, you know, handled very well by Department of Game and Fish representatives for advocates and representatives for the legislation, and ultimately we were able to successfully assuage people's concerns on all of this and all of the things listed. So outcomes and next steps for the legislation. We have, you know, ever since the signing of the bill by the governor on March 28th, we've been celebrating this legislative victory, getting it in the story into state media outlets, including the state NPR station, National Public Radio station, as well as various political outlets across the state. In mid-April, we had a celebratory and informational gathering for sponsors and advocates to kind of get together, you know, reflect on what went well, what didn't go well, and you know, and really put our heads together for next steps on the what we want to see as our vision for this legislation. Coming up, next steps, coordination with agency personnel to facilitate implementation of this bill. It's, you know, the legislature can tell an agency what to do all day long, and they do, but you know, you really got to work with the people on the ground in these agencies to facilitate the direction of the bill, including communication with agency officials. Well, like I said, we've had a close working relationship with the secretaries, the appointed secretaries of the Game and Fish Department and the Department of Transportation, and just continuing our communication with those officials to maintain direction and enthusiasm is key. And educational opportunities such as the one you're participating in now, using this New Mexico model to achieve similar results. And so hopefully we will have time to address people's questions at the end. That's all for my presentation, and so I will go ahead and turn it over to Susan. Thank you very much.
Oh, there we are. Okay, great. I'm just going to share my screen. Stand by with everyone.
Hey, Susan, we can see your screen.
Excellent. Okay, I'm just going to start this off. I apologize. There we go. All right. I think I've figured out the technical issues. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks to Phil and Craig for the background and the information about the state wildlife corridor bills. My name is Susan Holmes. I'm the Federal Policy Director from the Wildlands Network, and I want to take you through a little bit more about some of the states, but I want to start off with the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, which is getting introduced tomorrow. So we are here on the eve of its introduction, and I'm so excited to have you all on this call to talk about this and engage you in what I think is going to be an exciting ride for this legislation that starts tomorrow. So with that, I will move forward. Starting with the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, I wanted to refresh your memories. I think about a week ago or 2 weeks ago, we had this harrowing United Nations report on biodiversity, 1 million species at risk of extinction. And this report is truly a wake-up call to the world. So many of you on the call are already engaged in this issue and know a lot of these facts, but I think this provides us with an amazing opportunity to engage in a conversation about protecting biodiversity at the scale that it needs to be protected. And specifically in that report, there were a number of recommendations that are relevant to protecting wildlife corridors. They do talk about protecting a network of protected areas for biodiversity, particularly in the face of climate change, and the role of national governments in supporting conservation at a landscape and seascape level. And finally, protecting networks of interconnected protected areas. And these are exactly the kinds of things that we are doing at the Wildlands Network, but in particular are manifest in the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. So the Wildlife Corridors legislation the time is very ripe for this. We're seeing this, as Phil and Greg were saying, around the country. This year, 12 states pursued wildlife corridor legislation, and New Mexico has passed a bill, which is fantastic. There are a number of states, as Greg and others have said, Oregon and Pennsylvania also are still waiting, and New Hampshire are still pending. More about them as we go. But this number of wildlife corridor bills at the state level, we're seeing really, I think, is indicative of a trend that people want to see proactive, hopeful, inspirational solutions to what are these incredibly overwhelming challenges that we face in terms of protecting biodiversity. And we're seeing a growing bipartisan support for wildlife corridors around the country. And I'll talk a little bit about that in this slide. I think one of the things that we were surprised to see in the beginning of the Trump administration is an interest in wildlife corridors from that quarter. In fact, while Secretary Zinke was still there, they passed a secretarial order 3362, to improve habitat quality in western and big game winter and summer range and migration corridors. And this has been a very ambitious effort on the part of the Trump administration. And one of the few things that we can herald that they've done that's pretty good. It is being carried forward by Secretary Bernhardt. And you can see in this picture, this is actually a picture of in Department of Interior, in their internal offices here in Washington, D.C. And because it was such a priority, Secretary Zinke wanted to remind the staff that they needed to work on this. So you'll see that there's a little sign that says migration corridor over each door. And I think just the sort of breadth and depth of interest in this issue is extraordinary. In addition to the number of states that are interested in this, we've seen the Western Governors Association take this up as a priority issue in 2007. And more recently, the Conference of New England Governors and Eastern Canadian Premiers in 2016 passed a resolution which they are implementing in exciting ways in New England to protect wildlife corridors and ecological connectivity. So a lot going on around the country. And I want to bring it a little bit back to Washington, D.C. And to the infrastructure. There's a lot of talk about the infrastructure package and the infrastructure bill. But in D.C., the Senate and the House are each grappling with their own ways of approaching the infrastructure bill. One of the ways that the Senate is looking to do that is through the Surface Transportation Act reauthorization. And here you can see a picture of Wildlife Crossing, one of the many wildlife crossings in Canada. This one is in Banff. But we are very excited about the prospect, and it's looking, I think, very, very good for bipartisan support in the Surface Transportation Act for wildlife corridors and crossings, specifically for crossings. So the hope is that we'll be able to get funding through that federal mechanism as well. So again, an exciting opportunity, and I think a potential bipartisan support for wildlife corridor policy. Which brings me to the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. And as I said, we are on the eve of its introduction. We are so excited that this bill is being reintroduced. It's being reintroduced in the House by Congressman Beyer and in the Senate by Senator Udall. And I would have to say the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act is really one of the most exciting and I think ambitious recent bills to be introduced into Congress to protect wildlife. And indeed, it's really a 21st century solution to the vexing problem of protecting biodiversity. As Greg said, this bill is grounded in the science. This bill grew out of the science that has happened over the last 20 years and is really, really a bill that is designed to address the problem of biodiversity loss at the scale that it needs to be addressed. And we couldn't be more excited about its introduction. Just very briefly, the bill, I'll start with this slide, actually. We'll go with this slide. This just gives you a little bit of a visual of our champions in the House and the Senate. We have Senator Udall in the center there, Senator from New Mexico, Representative Beyer from Northern Virginia, and then we have the eminent biologist Dr. E.O. Wilson there on stage. This was 2 years ago when they first introduced the bill in Congress, and Dr. Wilson came and participated in a panel discussion where over 450 people attended at the U.S. Capitol. So just sort of that pent-up desire for proactive, positive policy solutions to protecting biodiversity was so evident, and we were so grateful for Dr. E.O. Wilson's support and continued support for the legislation. So here are the highlights of the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, and essentially it does 5 main things. It provides the designation of wildlife corridors on federal public land, either by nomination by states or agency action or congressional act. So you can designate wildlife corridors on federal public lands. So this would be Forest Service land, BLM land, DOD land is covered by this. It also covers marine areas and waters. So those corridors would be federally designated, and they would be part of a federal system of wildlife corridors. That's the first main component of the bill. The second component is that it creates a $50 million a year annual grant program for states and tribes to protect private lands, or states to protect their lands, or private land owners to protect their lands, excuse me, and to protect wildlife corridors. So this is really a bottom-up approach. The monies would go to the priorities that are defined by the states and the tribes and the private landowners. Although the money is managed by the federal government, the priorities are set by the states. And these corridors would not be designated, but it would be for the state programs, for the states to use as they see fit. Thirdly, it provides funds for tribes to protect wildlife corridors that support federal corridor efforts. So this new piece in the bill, this tribal component, is very, very exciting. And it recognizes the work that tribes have already been doing on their lands. Many tribes have been protecting wildlife corridors, and many of those wildlife corridors could or would link up to potential federal wildlife corridors. So this provision provides funds for that and incentives for tribes to protect their own wildlife corridors. It very importantly requires coordination. Obviously, when you have federal and state lands and private lands, there's going to need to be a great deal of coordination between these various different entities in order to protect wildlife corridors. And so there's a lot of coordination and consultation within the bill so that states and NGOs and local governments and tribes are very much engaged, both with the federal wildlife corridor designation as well as with the state wildlife corridor designation. And finally, it establishes a national native species database. that would be a place to compile data, and it would be widely shared with states, feds, et cetera, private landowners, tribes, and the like. So that would be the science, again, that Greg mentioned that undergirds all of this. That would really be the place where that is housed, and that would, again, be managed by the federal government on behalf of the people who are protecting wildlife corridors or want to protect wildlife corridors. And so we already do have one wildlife corridor designated, federally designated, and this gives you a picture, a little bit of the model that we're thinking about would probably be one of the most likely models of a wildlife corridor to be protected under the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. And here you can see the path of the pronghorn. This is the longest terrestrial migration in the lower 48 in Wyoming, and this was an area that we didn't know a lot about until relatively recently, but these pronghorn make an arduous migration between their summer and winter ranges, but that migration is threatened with development. So it was a lot of mapping and science came to play, and then in Wyoming, the local and federal government came together to modify and amend the forest plan so that it designated this wildlife corridor to protect the pronghorn. And that has been a real success with strong support from the state of Wyoming, as well as local landowners and the federal government. So the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act is getting introduced tomorrow with the support of over 220 groups. We're really excited about that. It includes a lot of conservation groups who you know, including National Wildlife Federation, Defenders of Wildlife, National Parks Conservation Association, Endangered Species Coalition, a lot of local organizations, also hunting and sporting groups, and land trust organizations like the Open Space Institute. So it's a broad coalition and a very exciting group of folks. As I said before, Dr. Yo Wilson, our scientific champion, he has this extraordinary quote, which I will read because it is so great. And it's the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act would provide the most important step at the present time in enlarging the nation's protected areas and saving America's wildlife and other fauna and flora. So we can't thank him enough for this support. And very briefly, we do have some exciting plans for the Wildlife Conservation Act moving forward. The bill is going to be introduced, as I said, tomorrow. We are hoping to have a very strong visibility campaign. Right now, we have a number of co-sponsors, and we're hoping for more in the Senate, but they include 3 of the presidential candidates, Senators Booker, Harris, and Sanders, as well as Senators Blumenthal, Wyden, and Merkley. And then in the House, we're going to continue with bipartisan efforts. So we're going to really work on seeing if we can continue or find a Republican to sponsor this, and we're hopeful that that will happen. Let me turn a little bit briefly to the states that I have been working with. And again, in the East, we're seeing a lot of excitement about wildlife corridor bills. New Hampshire passed its first bill in 2017, which was a study bill. They have a new bill this year that would implement that study, and it's seems to be doing quite well. It's passed through the Senate and will be heard in the House Transportation Committee next week. And it really is a bill about taking the recommendations of the study and finding ways to raise wildlife corridor protection as a priority in transportation, in trails, in parks, and in a whole suite of platforms across New Hampshire. In Virginia, I worked very closely with that bill, and here you can see our partner organization there, Virginia Wild. We were so lucky to work with over 30 conservation groups in Virginia to build a coalition that is very invested in this legislation and excited about it. The bill would have also created a study as well as a plan for wildlife corridor protection. Unfortunately, the bill was considered in the shortened session of the Virginia legislature this year. It did not make it through committee, but we are very excited about its prospects for next year. We've already started to plan for that and are talking to potential Republican co-sponsors and believe that we can make this a bipartisan bill and have it pass in 2020. And finally, in Pennsylvania, the bill was just introduced last week, and so we think it's got very strong prospects. This bill, again, is a study bill. It's very similar to the first New Hampshire bill that would study the wildlife corridors and the needs of wildlife in and connectivity in Pennsylvania. The bill was introduced last week with 23 co-sponsors. And I think maybe one of the things that's most exciting about this is the number of hunter and angler organizations that have gotten involved. Backcountry hunters and anglers, the Pennsylvania Confederation, or Federation of Sportsmen and Conservationists, and the Teddy Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, TRCP, are all actively working on this bill and towards its passage. So we're hoping for bipartisan support there, and I think the bill has good prospects. And finally, I'll just say briefly what you guys can all do to support wildlife corridors legislation. We would love you to amplify this bill on social media this week, the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, when it gets introduced tomorrow. We hope that you can ask your member of Congress and senators to support the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. We are eager to have this issue of wildlife corridors raised in the context of the presidential discussions and with presidential candidates. So we would urge you just to ask your candidates who you meet with to pay attention to wildlife corridors and to support state wildlife corridor bills as well, or ask your local representatives to introduce wildlife corridor bills. So with that, I will turn it over to Tracy.
Hi, everybody. Okay. Well, thank you, Greg, Phil, and Susan. This is a great presentation, and this policy work is very inspiring and very important. And I remember years ago when I first joined Wildlands Network, sitting around a campfire talking about how we needed some kind of federal legislation for corridors and state legislation and how great that would be. And 12 years later, here we are. So I'm really, really proud to be a very, very small part of this wonderful team and this coalition of partners doing great things. It's very inspiring for me. I'd also like to thank again all of our friends, colleagues, supporters, and partners who are working with Wildlands Network on this important legislation, and to the federal and state elected officials who are supporting and championing our work. Give me 1 second here. Okay. Last but not least, I would like to thank all of you one last time for taking the time to join us today, and to all of the donors bringing their passion and resources to Wildlands Network. Remember, if you would like to get involved, ask your member of Congress to support the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. You can support state wildlife corridor bills or ask your local representatives to introduce a wildlife corridor bill, and donate. Pushing through corridor legislation is very exciting, but it does require huge resources. We will need significant support for public education and to expand national and state campaigns. You will receive a follow-up email from us with a recording of this webinar, should you like to review it or share it with your friends and colleagues. Anyone who might want to learn more about our exciting policy work and the efforts that our partners and collaborators are doing. And with that, I think we will go to questions, and we will see if there are any questions for our panelists to answer. I'm going to, let's see here. There is, I'm going to have to, there we go. Okay, we have quite a few questions. Let's see. Let's see, these are just some great comments. People interested in Western policy. Here's one from, one of our donors. I'm interested in the Western Great Lakes as a bioregion across Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. What is unique here is the native ceded rights that in essence extend right across the current gray wolf. I'd like to connect with you to discuss this region. Okay, so I will pass that along to the right person, Robert. And let's go to we have a question. Are you finding opposition to the idea of wildlife corridors from abutters who are worried about possible human-wildlife confrontations? So who would like to take that question? Right?
Well, I haven't seen that question come up in the context of our wildlife corridor work, but I can tell you in Washington State right now, there's a, there's talk about reintroducing grizzly bears to the North Cascades region of the state. And that is causing some concern in the recreational community about folks who are frankly scared of running into a bear when they're hiking or otherwise traveling through national forests or wilderness areas that have been bear free and relatively large predator free for close to 100 years. So that issue is coming up. I haven't seen it in terms of any sort of organized opposition to the idea of reestablishing wildlife corridors, but that certainly is a fear, and it really speaks to the need for greater education and work on coexistence with large carnivores, which is another important aspect of our work, as that is sort of the other companion prong to wildlife corridors, is the restoration of large carnivores into ecosystems to improve their functionality and resilience. Though that class of mammal is can be fairly said to be the most persecuted in North America and probably around the world, and the most often removed from ecosystems. And it's because of the human interaction and fear thereof.
Okay, thanks, Greg. This is a question from another donor for Phil. Was the Mexican wolf program a problem?
As part of the Wildlife Corridors Act passage, no, beyond just, as I mentioned, kind of a general antipathy among some people to wildlife conservation. It came up a few times, but no, I think as this bill was largely framed as a combination of conservation and public safety initiative, people were generally more concerned about animals such as elk, deer, pronghorn that are typically collided with by vehicles. And so Mexican wolves, certainly were on the front of our minds among all the advocates working on this to ensure that that their migration was kept with a level of integrity, and that vehicle collisions were minimized with the animals.
Thank you, Phil. There's another question for you. This person's left the conference, but she can listen to it on tape. She said there are several overlaps between the Wildlife Corridors Act, Action Plan, and State Wildlife Action Plans. Where were these similarities discussed with New Mexico Game and Fish during the legislative process?
Yes, I'm certain they were. Unfortunately, I did not start until the legislative with Wildlands Network until the legislative process was already pretty along its way. The legislative session had already started, so I can't speak to specifics, unfortunately, about the overlap between the state wildlife plan and the wildlife corridors action plan. I'm sure going forward that these two initiatives are going to have strong overlap by our partners in the Department of Game and Fish.
Okay, thank you. I've lost my place here, and there's a very long question here, so let me just get to that.
Hey, Tracy.
Go ahead, Greg.
I was just going to say, while you look at that, we had received an earlier question before the webinar that I was going to address while you looked for that. We were asked what advice or tools we would have for a group consisting of municipal conservation commissions, a regional planning commission, a representative from state fish and wildlife department, and nonprofit organizations with missions specifically involving the local environment and land stewardship that is beginning to work together to establish local wildlife corridors that connect to larger forest blocks, which are part of the Northeast U.S. corridor. And this is a great question because it really gets to the next step of these processes. And these smaller local place-based collaboratives are groups that are being established across the country, and that we've been part of some. And in terms of advice, I would say, again, you need to know, the landscape that you're wanting to protect and why that's scientifically valid. And then it's a question of what tools do you have to protect those corridors. And, that may be local ordinances, it may be state legislation, it may be federal, but what's really important is that for any of these solutions to really endure, for them to really take hold, you've got to have local support and local buy-in for those corridors, because laws are only as effective as they're followed, and much better to have voluntary efforts and compliance with laws than have to rely on top-down enforcement. So the fact that the person asking this question already has a collaborative group with a variety of stakeholders is probably the most important first step. And then how you all work together really is going to depend on your landscape, the politics. Is it a lot of private land that you need to get easements? Is it state and federal land and you need to work with those land managers? It's really, you have to use all of your tools in the box, and there are groups that are available to help. We can help if we have capacity. The Center for Large Landscape Conservation has been the primary author of a large toolkit for legislators to look at ways to protect corridors. There are road ecology experts who have experience working with departments of transportation. In the New England states, where you have so many private lands and so many roads, the road density, of New England as compared to the middle of Wyoming is very different. But that also means you have a lot of culverts under, and small stream crossings. Those culverts can be repaired and used for wildlife crossing. There's a whole variety of ways you can work with the local stakeholders and really bring that local knowledge to bear, and getting the whole community bought in and celebrating, the idea that you're protecting your wildlife that are in your backyard is what's really going to make wildlife corridors endure for the long term.
Okay, thanks, Greg. There's a question here. It's more of a comment. It's we need to be careful that our efforts to define corridors are not used to allow development in the rest of the federal lands not designated. For instance, oil and gas development in all areas outside of corridors. So does anybody want to speak to that?
I think that's a great observation, and that's true even with the science of mapping. We need to be careful that our designation of corridors doesn't become so fine that people then use that as an excuse to do extractive industry measures or development outside of it. And of course, for a really resilient landscape, we need redundancy. If you think of a a braided stream with all of the various, paths that it channels through. We really need that redundancy, because as much as we plan, wildlife always surprises us. We may think we know where these animals are going to move, and then of course, best laid plans, they go exactly where we didn't think they were going to go. So we need to have that resilience. And the sad part is, though, at least right now, that use of oil and gas lease, for instance, they're leasing oil and gas leases in the path of the pronghorn as we speak. This administration is opening up those lands to further oil and gas development, even though it's a designated corridor. So, there's an instance where our federal designation isn't just holding enough doesn't have enough power to hold back an administration intent on, extracting energy, all energy everywhere at all costs. So whether it's within the corridor or outside of the corridor, we also need to remain vigilant. We need all of our conservation partners working at various angles within and without wildlife corridors on our public lands.
Yeah. The next question is for Susan, another donor. Susan, are we targeting Vermont and Maine?
Short answer is yes. Senator Sanders is an original co-sponsor of the bill, which is exciting, and hopefully that will give us an additional platform to get this in, as part of a presidential discussion. The Maine is absolutely at the top of our target list because of Senator Susan Collins, a Republican who has been relatively good on conservation issues. We have met with their office, we have approached them. They have so far not moved on the bill, but we haven't given up hope. So very, very much Maine and Vermont are engaged. We're hoping to engage them more, but in the case of Vermont, they're on as a senator. Senators is already on.
Excellent. And what was the barrier in committee in Virginia that caused it not to pass?
Well, I think there were really two barriers. Time was a big barrier. It's a shortened session, so it's very, very hard to get the time to really build the support that you have, and the problem of getting enough support in the short time frame we had was working against us. The other issue was the funding, and as Phil had mentioned, that's always a flashpoint. And so I think this was a session where they were not really allocating any new funds. This is they alternate years. One is a budget year and one is not, and this was a non-budget year. So the potential for this to have a budgetary impact was another issue in committee.
Okay, that's interesting. This question's from one of our very loyal and supporters. He's been with us for a long time. He's a monthly donor as well. And he'd like to know, what is Wildlands Network's position with regard to the Green New Deal? What impact do you anticipate the Green New Deal will have on our objectives? I'm going to give that to Susan.
Well, okay. So I don't think we have an official position on the Green New Deal, but I mean, I think so. Just to take a step back, the Wildlands Network is about bold and visionary action. And that's what the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act is. So I think in principle, we believe in that kind of bold and visionary action. While we have no position on the Green New Deal, I think the hope is that, for example, while we have wildlife corridors getting more visibility in the Senate through the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, that the same kind of forward thinking and energy that has ignited the public and Capitol Hill around the Green New Deal will sort of also be part of the energy that will infect the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. We are talking with some of the senators who are in support of that. All the presidential candidates, I believe, who are on the bill, Kamala Harris, Senator Booker, and Senator Sanders support the Green New Deal, and we're certainly talking to them about wildlife corridors and putting that in their, as a top line message for them when it comes to conservation. So no official position, but again, I think at least I would say that we're really supportive of the senators who are looking with that kind of vision and commitment to protecting the environment.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Do you want to add anything, Greg?
Well, I would say, there's obviously a lot of details missing in the Green New Deal, but if you look at our overall objective of saving 90% of biodiversity, if you think of E.O. Wilson's call to save 50% of the Earth's surface for biodiversity purposes, it's quickly apparent that climate change is a huge accelerant on all of the other human activities that have contributed to the fragmentation of our habitat and the decline and threats to biodiversity. So certainly acknowledging climate change as the massive threat that it is, moving to energy systems that start to, reduce carbon emissions on the mitigation side and change our economy away from extractive industries is obviously, absolutely critical in the future for biodiversity protection. My only fear would be that, as has often been the case with climate action in the past 20 years, 99% of the energy is focused on mitigating CO2 and very little has focused on adaptation strategies. Climate change is hitting us hard right now. It's hitting biodiversity hard right now. And the most often recommended strategy in response is wildlife corridors and connecting habitat. So we need some of that energy directed at saving what we have and the impacts that are happening, right now. And as long as that's part of the Green New Deal, and as long as the advocating for the Green New Deal doesn't result in another 4 years of the current administration, all the better.
Okay. Great. Thanks, you guys. The Great Old Broads for Wilderness have sent in a comment and a question, which Susan, I'm sure you can take offline. They've said that's fine. But I do want to point out that they said it was they worked with Wildlands Network and Susan in particular on a 5-day education and advocacy camp for the national bill last year. And Susan continues to work closely with them. And they just said it was an honor to work directly with Susan in DC to lobby for this bill. We're thrilled to see the reintroduction prospect, and we'll be lobbying again November 2nd through 7th with 20 of their broads. So she'd like to talk to you offline again, Susan. So I will just respond to her and let her know you'll be in touch. This was a great webinar. Thanks for the great information. This question is for Phil. How will this New Mexico Act affect borderlands?
Well, it doesn't have any specific international components being state legislation. However, there's a lot of interest in borderlands and border recovery of wildlife migration corridors along the border that, of course, are under threat from the ramped up national security issues under the Trump administration. There is an interesting component of interstate corridor mitigation and animal migration among tribal lands, and so that has a component potentially for borderlands issues. And I'd be happy to talk more and put you in touch if you'd like with our borderlands expert Miles Traphagen to kind of really dive down deep into this issue if you'd like.
That's great, and I'll make sure you get that contact information, Phil. Maybe you can follow up with them.
Thank you.
That'd be great. Thank you. Susan, any corridor legislation been introduced in Massachusetts?
Not that I'm aware of, but it's a great place. There's
Okay. There's a very long one here that I'm going to take offline after, and I'll have, it probably is best if many of you respond to this. So I'll share it and you guys can follow up offline maybe. Let's see here. We're nearly to the end. What information was given to ranchers and other private landowners to gain their acceptance? And I'm thinking probably that I don't know if that's a national question or one for Miles. I mean, Phil. So I'm sure
Go
it's
for it, Bill.
yeah.
Okay, yeah. Certainly, you know, we had concern as any wildlife conservation bill does from livestock growers on this, and so we worked with them to really, you know, ensure that they understood that this wasn't an initiative to really create a new paradigm for animal conservation, for wildlife conservation, as much as to really bolster existing animal migration and wildlife corridors that they've been living around for, you know, time, you know, stretching back, you know, hundreds of years in some cases in New Mexico. You know, working with the agencies like Department of Transportation and Department of Fish and Wildlife, they have long-standing relationships with livestock growers in the state. And so we really worked to ensure alongside our agency partners that we would continue these, you know, collaborative efforts with livestock growers and ranchers to both, you know, improve habitat, but also allow them to maintain their business and way of life.
Okay. Greg, a question for you. What is the legal status of an established corridor? Can the administration be sued if they violate the law?
I don't think there are any. I think the only legally established corridor right now is probably the Path of the Pronghorn, which is a designation. And then I do not recall what prescriptions, management prescriptions are existent on the Path of the Pronghorn. In theory, you would want a designation that would have enforceable measures on land managers. That really doesn't exist as far as I know right now. If you look at, for instance, the regulations under the National Forest Management Act for our national forest lands, there's an obligation for forest planners to consider wildlife corridors in their forest plan revision. So for instance, the Northwest Forest Plan is on a slow boat to revision right now, and we'll be looking at advocating for the designation protection corridors there. But in terms of enforcement mechanisms, the best we can do, for instance, on a National Forest Management Act plan is to sue the agency if we don't think they've done a good enough job in their environmental impact analysis or in meeting the mandates of the forest plan. So the enforceability of action, management action, is challenging at best. And it's, as you may have witnessed in the state bills that have been moving forward so far, you know, they're mostly study bills, come up with a plan, come up with a state action plan, but they're notably lacking in official designation of anything on the ground or an enforcement mechanism to, you know, to push that forward, as well as the funding to make that happen. So, you know, that top-down enforcement approach just really isn't there yet on wildlife corridors. And given the scale that we're talking about and the multiple jurisdictions across which these corridors will, you know, path or across if they are done, you know, effectively for wildlife, that top-down enforcement is going to be challenging. And that's why, you know, we are encouraging these local place-based collaboratives that really get community buy-in and support for protecting wildlife corridors. Now, of course, if you have an enforceable easement or you're purchasing the property, you know, that gives you contractual rights for those private properties. But as it stands, there really aren't enforceable federal or state requirements to protect wildlife corridors.
Okay, and then the last question is from one of our friends at the Center for Large Landscape Activity, I believe. He's saying regarding the new Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, we appreciate the initial emphasis on federal land, but few corridors can be fully functional on federal land. I believe that the Path of the Pronghorn, which you presented as the first as a classic first federal corridor, passes through some private lands. If the Conservation Act passes, will the National Native Species Habitats and Corridors database include corridors on non-federal land? And if so, the act should call for development of consistent criteria and transparent procedure for nominating and vetting important corridors.
Okay, so that's a big question. I think I've got it. So in terms of, there are really two parts to the bill to address the issue that as very critical. Corridors are going to run across a matrix of federal, state, private, tribal lands, and so designation on federal lands is not probably enough for most species. So the second main component of the bill is this grant program that again is designed to be following the state priorities, but is also, the hope is that these corridors will integrate and align hopefully with the federal corridors as well. So in the case of the Path of the Pronghorn, you're absolutely right. There were private lands. There was a lot of work done with local landowners to modify fencing and to create that corridor. But those private lands, on those private lands, the corridor is not designated. So just to make that distinction here, the designation would only occur on federal public lands, but there are incentives and there's funding to support corridor protection on non-federal lands. Let's see, the second part of that, I think, was having to do with, Tracy, refresh my memory.
Oh, sorry. He's just saying that he's talking about the corridors database.
The database, that was it, yeah. So the database actually, so the database is interesting because this is one of the few areas that we were surprised to see had a lot of pushback from private landowners. I think unwarranted, but concern of private landowners having their data in a federal database. And so this was one of the flashpoint issues when this bill was, the bill was widely circulated. Diverse group of private landowners, sportsmen's groups, associations of states, et cetera, to review. And one of the things that came up again and again and again was the concern about private landowners having their land in a federal database. So the bill currently, the database is specific to federal lands, but it, you know, hopefully there will be collaboration with states and feds and tribes and all of these other players through this collaborative effort so that we will accomplish the goal of that kind of integration of state, federal, and private lands to protect wildlife corridors. Only the federal piece will be designated, but there'll be protections across that matrix of lands.
That's interesting. Okay, thank you. That about wraps it up. If I did not get to your question, we will absolutely address it offline. I think I did get them all though. And let me just say one last time, thanks everybody for coming, for your support, and for spending some of your precious time with us today. And with that, I think we will end the webinar. So have a great day, everybody. Thanks, panelists, for taking the time.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, Ben.
All right. Bye-bye.